Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. As always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for supporting the show. We appreciate it. You can do so by going to jeffersonhour.com, click on donate, and while you're there, you can find out about all of Clay's cultural tours and retreats. And we're recording this in mid to late September, and when it airs, you, sir, will either be in France or on your way home.
Yes, I'm taking a group to Jefferson's France, beginning in the last days of September 2022. This will be my fourth time doing this. We'll go to Paris for a few days. There are lots of Jefferson sites in and around Paris, and then we'll go to the south on one of the great bullet trains of Europe to see the classical ruins at Nîmes, where the Maison Carrée was that served as the model for the capital at Richmond, and to Arles and Orange and Aix-en-Provence and Marseille. That classical world made Jefferson salivate, and it changed the architectural style of the New World. He insisted that the new capital at Richmond be based upon the Maison Carrée. He inaugurated the neoclassical movement in the United States, not alone, but principally. And that's why almost every state has a domed state capitol rather than a red brick 18th century sort of capital of the sort you see at Independence Hall in Philadelphia. So I love taking this trip. The food is, of course, fantastic. The wines are exquisite. The French are not quite Jefferson's French. He said you could live your entire life there without hearing a single rude remark. But they are an exquisitely civilized people. And I always think that it's so important for us to look at life in other places done in slightly other ways and realize that there are many paths to human happiness. Ours is just one of them.
I bring up France because it figures greatly in this week's conversation. It's a 10 Things episode with yourself, sir, and Lindsay Chervinsky, and we talk a great deal about Jefferson's daughters and their time in France.
Jefferson went to France in 1784. He was there until November of 1789. He came home then, what he thought was on leave. He was going to go back to see the French Revolution through. When he got back, as everybody knows, George Washington had nominated him to be the first Secretary of State, and so he remained in the U.S. for the rest of his life. He had an extraordinary 5-year sojourn in France, and he really got his fill of painting, music, dance, sculpture, gardens, architecture, and salon conversation, and became a different human being, frankly. Theodore Roosevelt was transformed out on the plains and badlands of North Dakota. Thomas Jefferson was a grieving widower when he went to France in 1784, and he returned a different man, deeply cultured in new ways, wiser, more sober, and frankly more radical. When he saw what a failed state can be, France, in his time, he determined that we must never, ever allow ourselves to get into the position of being a failed state. And guess what, David? Here we are.
Okay, on that happy note, shall we go to the program?
Let's go to the program. People can learn about other events, online courses that are coming, the winter encampments, of course. The salmon trip for next summer on the Lewis and Clark Trail is almost full, so if you're coming, sign up now. And next fall, a year from now, we're going to Greece, to Homeric, Greece, and people can start to find out about that. It'll be on the site shortly, but there's going to be a huge waiting list for that. I'm so eager to take people to Thomas Jefferson's Greece. He never went there, but hey, we'll make it work. Thanks for listening, David, and thanks for brokering these conversations with Lindsay.
It's my
we need
pleasure.
you to step in and say, should we get back to the list or not? Are you two stop squabbling?
I hate to do that. It's so much fun to listen to the two of you, but I shall continue on.
We appreciate it, and thanks for being the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. So listen, everyone, to this special edition of the Jefferson Hour. A little hard on Jefferson, but I think he deserves it. Jefferson and his daughters, Maria and Martha.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. This week we are joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson, and our returning guest. I almost hate to call you a guest at this point, Lindsay. You're so familiar to our audience and to us, but also Lindsay Chervinsky. And this week it's a 10 Things episode, and we're talking about Jefferson and his daughters, or perhaps Jefferson and women as well. And I would start with you, Clay. Can you give us some backstory?
Well, he had 6 children with his wife, Martha Wales Skelton Jefferson, 4 of whom died young. His only son died at 17 days, was never given a name. It was clear that he wouldn't live. He had 2 daughters named Lucy, one who died very young, and then kind of, I hate to use the term, but kind of a replacement Lucy. But the 2 daughters who lived to be adults were Martha, whom he called Patsy, and Maria, or Mary, whom he called Polly. They were the surviving children, and even then, his younger daughter, Maria, died in April 1804 while he was serving his first term as president, and that's what led Jefferson in a letter to Mrs. Cosway to say, "I was born to lose everything I love." So on the white side, Jefferson is known to have 6 children, only one of whom survived him, Martha, who lived another decade after his death in 1826. And then, of course, there's the Hemings family, and there were 4 children that we know of, maybe 6 pregnancies, that family Jefferson never acknowledged, but we are pretty certain now that he was the father of those children, 2 of whom walked away from the plantation and simply disappeared into American life, and 2 of whom identified themselves as African American. All of them were either free or legally freed by the time they were in their 20s.
Well, and we should add that the reason we don't totally know all that much about this potential daughter is evidence suggests and family lore confirms that she was so light-skinned that she may have moved to Washington, D.C., and basically was able to disappear into white society. And so changed her name, changed her identity, and thus was able to take on a completely different life. And sometimes we can recover those individuals in the historical record, but most of the time we can't, and that is by design because they did not want to be found.
So Jefferson's mistress, concubine, common law wife, slave partner, however we want to define Sally Hemings, was called by one of the overseers, quote, mighty near white, and several of her children were whiter still in outward appearance, and therefore, if they chose to, could pass as white, and at least this young daughter appears to have done exactly that. She was not freed. She walked away. She was allowed to walk away from Monticello, and this was not that uncommon in the plantation world, that a person who could pass as white was sometimes simply permitted to disappear.
In talking with you, Clay, in previous conversations about his daughters, I want to start with the question of, was Jefferson an overly harsh father to his daughters?
Oh, the 21st century would say yes, by all means. I'm speaking only of his white children now because, and I'll just repeat again and then not have to say it more, he didn't have any known contact with his African-American children. He may have had some, but it would have been very much detached. There's no part of me or any historian believes that he sought a relationship with these children. Just the opposite, that he assumed that they'd appeared almost magically into the world and didn't want to acknowledge his paternity. He knew better, and people around him knew better, but this was an illusion that plantation owners maintained, and it was a very convenient illusion, and some of their wives, white women who knew perfectly well that there was funny business going on those plantations, chose to pretend that nothing of the sort was occurring. But these were open secrets, let's say.
Well, especially we should say because the children lived at Monticello. They were at the estate.
And resembled their father.
Some were
So
even suggested to have like slightly reddish hair.
reddish hair and
So like he would have seen them. He would have met them.
But you agree he would have been able to detach himself from their
Yes.
existence.
Yes, but it was not like he never saw them. I think we should just make that very clear. Like they would have been around.
As to his two white daughters that we have some interaction with, he was very severe. He would write them these letters saying things like, the minute you get up in the morning, you have to have, your dress needs to be perfectly placed and no wrinkles. And if you have your hair up, the pins need to have, there can't be any dishevelry. If there's a spot on your dress, you'll be the last to see it, but everybody else will see it. And they'll regard you as a slut. Now, slut didn't mean quite what it means now, but it was still a pretty strong term. So he would say, from the moment you get up, you need to be presentable to the world. And if you're not, that's going to be a problem. And he said to his younger daughter, and by the way, wear an umbrella when you go outside, because nothing is worse on a woman than if she gets a suntan. And then he would write to his older daughter, Martha, saying, if you want my love, you will master Livy in Latin, and you will be able to read Don Quixote in Spanish. So whether he was profoundly more severe than other parents or just severe is a question I leave to Lindsay. But today, some of his letters to his daughters would be regarded as abusive.
It'd be interesting to get some perspective from you, Lindsay, as well. I mean, what women faced during this time. I mean, we have a general idea of them being second-class citizens, but can you shed any light on that?
Yeah. So let me talk about sort of like general womanhood, and then I'll address Clay's question. So women at the time had very few legal rights. There were moments when women made improvements in terms of suffrage. So, for example, during the Revolution, women had the right to vote in New Jersey for a very small period of time. But by and large, they didn't really have legal rights. They couldn't typically own property unless they were a widow. And that was under a system called coverture, which meant that you were basically covered by first your father and then your husband. So when a woman was married, all of the property that she owned or inherited from her family or her dowry typically went to her husband, and she had no legal control over it. Sometimes that was fine, and sometimes if a husband was a degenerate gambler, they could lose everything, and she really had little recourse. They had no legal rights in terms of protections against domestic abuse, so the conceptions of abuse were different than ours today. It's not to say that they were fine with it, but people generally turned a blind eye unless it was so severe that a woman's life was in danger, and then usually her family just removed her from the circumstance. There was very rudimentary forms of birth control. So pregnancy was a common part of a woman's life from the time she was married to the end of her childbearing years, if she made it that long. Childbirth was very dangerous, as Jefferson knew quite well. And because they didn't have the same understanding about medicine, the same abilities, they couldn't perform C-sections, things that, I mean, childbirth is still can be dangerous today, but just incrementally so, especially if you've born 10, 12, 14 children, which was not all that unusual. Your body does start to wear down. So it could be a very, very difficult life. If women got past childbearing age, usually they actually lived longer than their husbands. So there was sort of a lengthy possibility of widowhood. Most women, if they were in middle or upper classes, were taught rudimentary reading and writing and arithmetic because it made good sense for managing a household. You had to be able to sort of manage your account books. You needed to be able to read your Bible. So you had to be able to have the skills, maybe basically exchange rudimentary letters. So there was education. Not all women were as well educated as Patsy or Martha or Abigail Adams. Not all women had access to the classics and could quote Cicero off the top of their heads. Some did, but it really depended on the family and their view of how a woman should be educated, because there wasn't a widespread system of public education. So that's sort of the general life. That women were expected to be wives and mothers, though, and helpmates around the farm or plantation or business or shop or whatever it was that their father and then husband did. So in terms of Jefferson, Clay, you're absolutely right that parents, I think for the most part, tended to be harsher back then. Sometimes, as I'm reading John and Abigail's letters to their children, they certainly weren't low of expectations and could be pretty particularly intense, especially with John Quincy, because he seemed to have the most potential. And they could be harsh, especially with their daughters-in-law. Abigail must have been a fearsome mother-in-law, and I don't know that I would have wanted that. Where
Poor
I think
Louisa. Poor Louisa.
I know,
She bonded with her father-in-law, John Adams, because
yes.
her mother-in-law apparently was really awful to her.
Although, interestingly, Abigail seems to have had a much better relationship with the wives of her other sons. So it was something about John Quincy and Louisa being born outside of the United States that Abigail really struggled with. But interestingly, John and Abigail seem to have treated their daughters quite different. They wanted them to be educated, and they were very well educated. And they believed in the importance of having a house partner. Like, I don't know that I would say partner like we would think of in terms of equality today, but they believed in that importance. But they didn't seem to be as harsh on their daughters as they were on their sons. And so I think most parents typically were less harsh on their daughters just because the realm of expectations was so much smaller.
And just to say, to put a bow on that, David, physical violence against children was routine in this era, especially against boys. That in schools, the rod was used to teach boys Latin and to make them learn long Greek paradigms and so on. And physical violence was widespread in people's homes and was accepted. I think we need to take a break, but when we come back, I want us to talk about Jefferson's granddaughter, Anne, for a moment, because she was involved in an abusive relationship, and watching the family try to negotiate that is really a sad and interesting story.
Very good. We're going to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week, 10 things about Jefferson and his daughters. And Clay, when we took our break, you were talking about his granddaughter, Anne?
Yes, just quickly, Lindsay had mentioned that domestic violence and domestic abuse existed, of course, in this era, and it was seen as mostly a private matter, as frankly it still largely is in our culture. But we know this about Jefferson's grandchildren. He had more than a dozen of them. Martha had 12 children, 11 of whom lived to be adults. One of his favorite granddaughters was Anne, who married a man named Charles Bankhead. And Bankhead turned out to be a very rough customer. He drank excessively, he was verbally abusive, and he hit Anne, his wife, Jefferson's granddaughter, on a number of occasions. And it's just agonizing to read the correspondence, because Jefferson is a non-interference kind of a guy. He shrinks from conflict. He's a harmony obsessive. He doesn't really want to face any of this, but he knows what's going on. And he's, of course, deeply wounded by this and wants in any way he can to help Anne. Eventually, Charles Bankhead and Jefferson's favorite grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, get in a brawl on the streets of Charlottesville. And there's a whip and there's a knife, and his grandson is knifed and might die. And Jefferson has to ride down the mountain as an elderly man and he sits and weeps at the bed of his grandson in a store in Charlottesville as he tries to survive this knife wound. And the whole family is just beside themselves with, what do you do? Divorce was not a simple matter. Extricating this guy from the house, Jefferson had some of the liquor locked up, and it was really one of those awful things where you're just trying to figure out what's the path of least provocation that can somehow make this, if not work, at least not blow up. When I read that story, I always think of how strange it is, Lindsay, that Jefferson is always talking about the paradise of Monticello and the Blue Ridge Mountains and the kind of utopian agrarian villa he has there. It's a villa that's maintained by enslaved labor. And then there is domestic abuse of this sort, and not just Anne Bankhead and her husband Charles, but Jefferson's daughter Martha was married to Thomas Mann Randolph, who was mentally unstable for long periods of his life. He was verbally abusive, and he often withdrew from the whole family and just said, "Nuts to you," and went off to some shack somewhere and lived alone. So there was a lot of chaos at the heart of this so-called harmonious Virginia family.
Yeah, it was very dramatic. I think one of the challenges at the time was alcohol consumption was higher than it is today because drinking water was often unsafe. So it was a part of life even more than it is in American society at the moment. And people understood that there was like a disease in your spirit. And it was often hereditary. The Adams also suffered it through Abigail Adams' family line, and their children often were really, really struggled with this. But there wasn't an understanding of how to treat it or how to manage it, or not that you can ever really get rid of addiction, but they didn't know how to address that problem. There weren't really rehabs. And so often we see people who maybe would be able to get help today to tackle some of those demons were not able to. And the problem with this abusive relationship, and so many of the relationships at the time, is husbands had complete legal control over their wives. So if they wanted to, take their wives somewhere, they could. And so what Jefferson and his family were trying to do is find a way to sort of protect her. But if Charles wanted to take Anne with him, then he had the legal right to do so. And so there's just real limitations to this process. And I think for Jefferson, not only was he so against confrontation, but so against physical violence as a person himself, it was just horrifying.
If my daughter were in a relationship in which her husband or the man in her life hit her, I would step in and say, that's the last time that happens. And if it happens again, I can promise you X, whatever X turns out to be. That wasn't how Jefferson was wired, and that wasn't the legal status of women in this era. Men had an enormous autonomy to be toxic, and they used it.
Yeah, it wasn't against the law to hit women. Women could be physically restrained or physically, what's the word that they used? Corrected, as long as it wasn't life-threatening.
Pulling us back to today's subject, Jefferson and his daughters, I would like to know from the both of you, you kind of have this image of wealthy, aloof, brilliant people in that period not really interacting with their children on a regular and daily basis as most parents do. And also, I would like you both to talk about the education Jefferson's daughters received, because that in itself, to me, is a very interesting story.
I'll start. The education they received was very informal and indirect. No formal tutors. They would have been taught by itinerant dancing masters and harpsichord masters and so on, who would kind of wander around the plantation world and teach for a week here and a few days there. So they would have learned etiquette and how to bow, how to hold themselves, how to dance the minuet, how to sit, how to greet somebody at table, how to be the hostess. They would have learned all that. And of course, Jefferson's daughters didn't have the advantage of a mother. They grew up in some ways with their aunts, and that helped to a considerable degree, but they didn't have education in the way that a young woman would today, certainly not a school. Jefferson was privately tutored at area schools by clergymen during his childhood. That this did not exist for women. Jefferson had a huge library, and I'm sure that he inculcated in his daughters a life of reading. And we have a story that later in life, when he had grandchildren, there would be a period when they would all sit in one of the drawing rooms, and everybody would have a book. Each person would choose a book, however young or old. And then Jefferson would say, all right, begin. And there would be a period of 20 or 30 minutes of absolute silence when no one was allowed to say a word. And they would all be either reading or pretending to read. And that was a kind of a daily occurrence of the old man inculcating the life of the mind. But women's education was largely neglected, and a woman had to really fight for it. She had to really be resourceful if she were going to do this, because what she did learn was how to knit, how to quilt, how to crochet, how to dress a pig. There's a letter in which Jefferson tells his younger daughter Polly, "It's time for you to figure out how to pluck a chicken. It's time for you to figure out how to make a ham." And so this is the farm. It's a working farm.
But when they went to Paris, Jefferson saw to it that they were educated.
Yes, Martha went to the Abbé de Penthamon, this Catholic girls' school, and Polly later did briefly too. And Jefferson, this was arranged by Lafayette, and Jefferson was assured that his daughters would not be proselytized by Catholicism while there. That was not quite true, and it turns out that Jefferson had to yank his daughter Martha out of the Penthamon, but she did get the sole formal education of her life in Paris.
Oh, didn't Martha plan at one point on becoming a nun?
Yes, so I'm really interested in Lindsay's view of this, so let me try to set it up. I met an eminent feminist about 20 years ago at a dinner party in Washington, D.C., who said to me, "Mr. Jenkinson, don't you believe that Jefferson committed psychological incest with his daughters?" And I shrank back at that. That seems like a very, very powerful term. But it does point to something, that Jefferson had an intense relationship with his daughters, a protective and paternalistic relationship with his daughters, a demanding relationship with his daughters, and in a certain sense, he arranged their lives. When they came back from Paris in November of 1789, it wasn't but a few weeks before his daughter Martha was engaged to Thomas Mann Randolph, someone she hadn't seen in 5 years. She only had seen him when she was a child. So this can't be love at first sight on a plantation in Virginia. This looks arranged to me, although Jefferson, of course, said nothing could be, this is exactly what I would have chosen. I had nothing to do with it. Isn't this great? But he played such a heavy shaping influence in his daughters' lives that he didn't allow them the freedom to become what they might otherwise have become. And it seems to me that, in a way, he dictated the course of their lives, and that they suffered from it. And I think, Lindsay, that there was damage. And when his daughter Martha let him know in Paris that she was thinking of becoming a nun, young people are impressionable, and it was a very powerful school, and she saw young women making this vow. Young people are often susceptible to heavy religious vocation, at least briefly. B, this was the time when Sally Hemings appeared on the scene in France, and it's possible, and I know this from a similar incident in my own background, that she may have been so repulsed by what she saw as her father's middle-aged sexuality with a taboo woman that she rushed to the other end of the pendulum. We don't know. All we know is that she made it clear that she was thinking about taking vows, and Jefferson didn't wait a single afternoon. He went straight over with his carriage, pulled her out of that school, and brought her back to his place on the Champs-Élysées. So, Lindsay, there's a lot there for Freud to unpack. How would you unpack it?
Yeah, let me just add a couple of other details. So the one other area that they were well educated in was music. So that was a passion, of course, of Jefferson's, and probably one of the things that Martha picked up from her mother before her mother died, because usually children were taught instruments and music from a very young age. So I just wanted to add that one element. I think that, and we talked about this a little bit on the episode where we talked about the challenges with Jefferson, that Jefferson really liked to shape his life around him and shape the people around him. And it wasn't necessarily out of cruelty per se. It was almost, I think it was a self-absorption. It was just like he liked his life to be the way that it was. And he maybe thought that other people were happy with it too. But I think he was such a magnetic force that when he was unhappy with them, he wouldn't even really necessarily say it. I think that I get the sense that he would withdraw, and that immediate and clear displeasure was enough usually to push people to do what he wanted, because then when he was happy with them, that also was such a powerful force that it radiated. And so I think that was really the way that he sort of I know the word control is strong, but I think it was sort of a subtle form of control over their lives. Now, of course, pulling her out of the school is a very physical action, but then I think the choices around it were often shaped without words, without necessarily demands. It was this sort of, force of personality. And at times he really encouraged them through this, pros and cons situation to make choices like the choice of Thomas Mann Randolph Jr. as a husband for Martha, as just, and they were such bad choices in the long run. And so I think that is really the nature of their relationship. And it kind of became almost, especially with Martha, a little bit codependent because he relied on her for so much. And she was so similar to him that she really wanted him to be happy. And so I wouldn't ever say incestuous, but I would say maybe codependent.
Abigail Adams noticed, they came to Paris, they saw the Penthemon, they saw a ceremony in which some of these girls, these young women, were taking the vows, and they had to lie down naked on this slab of ground, and then they were covered and veiled, and it was a very, very elaborate Catholic ceremony, gorgeous and extremely detailed. And Abigail said, this is not good. This is not good. Are you sure you want your daughter to be in this environment? Doesn't look like they're non-proselytizing to me. So as usual, Abigail Adams always gets it right. She said the same thing when she met Sally Hemings, when Sally Hemings came over on her way with Polly, and she thought, this is not the kind of chaperone I think is best suited to leading Jefferson's younger daughter to Paris. He is a widower, after all. So Abigail had these shrewd insights, and I think Lindsay's right. Jefferson very much wanted to shape the world around him for harmony, and it was selfish as we see it, but he didn't see it as selfish. He thought, I want to live in a world of harmony. I want my daughter to be a substitute spouse for me in a certain way. I want her to be my hostess. We're going to have conversations in the evening. I want her to have read books so that we can talk about those things. I want her to have exquisite manners. I want her to be good at household management, which she was. He shaped her to be an ideal plantation woman. The problem was he shaped her to be his ideal plantation woman and barely allowed her to have her marriage with poor Thomas Mann Randolph. Part of the reason that he had nervous breakdowns is, imagine being the son-in-law of Thomas Jefferson.
You and I, Clay, have talked many times about the impact living in France had on Jefferson.
Yeah.
And how much he loved France. But, I'm thinking about these young, impressionable daughters of Jefferson moving from Virginia to Paris. Do we have any kind of an idea, the long-term effect on them and the Hemings?
Martha, Jefferson said, spoke better French than he did. She picked it up almost immediately. That's very typical young person, older person. She became worldly. I mean, she was a cosmopolitan figure. I mean, she was what we would call a catch. The person she caught, Thomas Mann Randolph, had been in Europe. He had studied some in Edinburgh. So she became she was an extraordinary woman in almost every respect, and greatly worthy of admiration. Maria, did not want to go to Europe. She had been left behind with the Epps, with the aunt. She knew them better than she knew her father and her sister. Jefferson tried to cajole her to come to France. She didn't want to come to France. In the end, she was tricked. She was led onto a ship in the harbor at Norfolk to play, they said. She fell asleep on the ship, and when she woke up, the ship was out to sea, and she had a chaperone named Sally Hemings. This sounds horrible to me. This sounds like a terrible thing. She was kidnapped in a certain sense and taken from the only family that she knew. Her mother was long since dead. She was taken from the only family that she knew to meet a father that she didn't really remember and a sister that she didn't know in a country she'd never been to. And her chaperone was a 14-year-old enslaved girl. She was never a confident human being. She always felt less than her sister, less loved than her sister. She always felt she never really measured up to her father's expectations. But she defied her father in certain ways. She wouldn't come live at Monticello the way Martha always would. And she built a fairly successful marriage with Jack Epps, her cousin. which was a much more successful marriage. Unfortunately, she died in pregnancy, but it was a much more successful marriage than her sister had with Thomas Mann Randolph. So, Lindsay, I think that Maria, we would say, was damaged by some of this, if that's not too strong a term.
I think that that's absolutely right. So she lost her mother at a younger age, didn't have much memory of her, was certainly not the apparently looked a great deal like her mother, maybe resembled her mother in character as well, in terms of that she was very warm and lovely and apparently a beautiful musician and was an exceptional hostess, but she wasn't the intellectual powerhouse that Jefferson was or that Martha was. And so she always kind of felt left out. She felt like the third wheel, especially when she hadn't been around them for so long. And so it was pulling her away from the only family she knew. And therefore, I think it's totally unsurprising that when she had the choice, she dove right back into that Epps family and married her cousin, gross, and
her first cousin.
Gross. And I know, so I say that now, but that was not uncommon at the time. So I'm casting judgment when I shouldn't. But and then didn't really fit in the same way in Paris and in France, and she certainly learned things from it and took things from it, but it was not the same formative experience that I think it was for Martha.
Very good. We need to take a short break, but we'll return to this conversation with Clay Jenkinson and Lindsay Chervinsky in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week, a conversation with Clay Jenkinson and Lindsay Chervinsky about Jefferson's daughters. And we spent a lot of time talking about them in Paris, and I'd like to bring us back to Virginia, but Clay, you had a comment about Lindsay's reflections?
Well, about both of our reflections. We're being a little hard on Mr. Jefferson, and I'm guessing he deserves it. He was a control obsessive in all areas of his life, and this was one of them. And he had a definite idea of what daughters of Thomas Jefferson should be, and he used many different tactics, from praise to shame, to bring that about. But we need to remember that they lived in splendor. Monticello was not an average house. This was a man of extraordinary genius. Scientific instruments all over the place, books everywhere, maps, paintings, sculpture, the finest china, the finest silver, excellent food, nothing ever out of place. That Jefferson's Monticello was an exemplum of what an Enlightenment life was supposed to look like, at least for the patriarch. And his children had beautiful clothes. He got the musical instruments, including very expensive ones, harpsichords and so on. There was a kind of a muted, small R Republican luxury at Monticello that most young people in America could never even dream about, much less realize in their lives. It was a world of exquisite manners. It was like a minuet that was running 24 hours a day. And so that doesn't bring happiness, Lindsay, but we have to keep in mind that this was a very special place, and like most fathers, and particularly a genius, Jefferson did not spend oodles of time with his children. There was a lot of free time because he was in his study writing, 12 letters a day, etc. So I try to imagine what their lives were like, but I think it comes from something that you said a moment ago, Lindsay. Their main business in life was to please or not displease him.
Yeah, I want to one additional thing in agreement and one pushback. So the additional thing in agreement is there were also phenomenally interesting people coming through all the time. So it would not have ever been a boring place to live, and conversation would have been sparkling. I think you're right in terms of depicting the life in that way, but you said for the patriarch, and I think that's a really important moment to highlight. Yes, they had instruments, they had beautiful clothes, they had wonderful wine and food, and they got to enjoy all of those things and access to books and scientific instruments. But if you go to, first of all, for a lot of the time, Monticello was under construction, and anyone who's lived through construction knows just how much fun that is. Now, they obviously weren't doing the work themselves, but nonetheless, they were living through a construction zone. Second, if you go to Monticello today, which I highly recommend everyone does, the quality of the rooms that he enjoyed and that the rest of the family enjoyed are pretty different in terms of the private spaces. So my guess is that the private spaces and the life for Martha and her gazillion children and grandchildren, that would have been a little bit more cramped and a little bit less luxurious than we think of Thomas Jefferson's existence. So I think those are just a couple important details to keep in mind.
No, I think that's nonsense, but I take your point.
Well, let me put it this way. If you had your choice of rooms, would you like the really, really beautiful alcove, or would you like the room up in the dormers with the window at the floor so it doesn't ruin the symmetry?
They were up there in the dome hanging out and watching the stars. They were playing with the magic doors. They were playing with the wine dumbwaiter. They had servants and slaves to do everything that could possibly be needed. All they had to say was, I need butter, and somebody would go run for this. I do think it was a little bit what Mary Wollstonecraft said. You know, they were like gilded birds in a cage.
That's fair.
There wasn't a free life, that's for sure. I mean, Jane Austen, people of that era, women didn't have privacy. Their privacy was really, really, really hard to get anywhere. There's a lot of space for privacy at Monticello, but I'm guessing that young people there were almost never alone.
Yeah.
Let's move through some of the points that you've given to me, Clay. Let's start with April 1804 and the death of Polly.
So the first term of Jefferson's presidency, his wife has been dead since 1782. Sally Hemings is in the story somewhere. He goes to Washington to be the third president of the United States, lives there alone mostly with Meriwether Lewis. The daughters come up once together, and Martha will come up a second time, but he's essentially commuting during the vacations back to Monticello. His younger daughter, Maria Polly, is quite like his wife in physiognomy and in constitution, and she dies from birthing, I think, her third child. And she dies on April 17th, 1804. She's just a young woman. And Jefferson is devastated. He's not there, for one thing. He gets there shortly after this. But he says in a letter to one of his oldest friends, John Page, others may give of their abundance, but I in my want have given the half of all that I have. My evening prospects now hang on the slender thread of a single life. And so you see, I mean, I think it's the second biggest blow of his life. The first biggest blow of his life was the death of his wife on September 6, 1782, when he had a nervous breakdown, in my opinion. But the second biggest blow was the death of his daughter, Maria. And I think, Lindsay, in part because she did so resemble his wife, and she was sort of an embodiment, in a way, of that memory of his life. And, of course, any parent has a hard struggle having buried a child, and especially an adult child. It struck Jefferson very hard, is all I'll say, Lindsay.
Yeah, I mean, for all of his ability to detach and to compartmentalize, he obviously felt things quite deeply and loved his children, even if he didn't show it in the way that we necessarily would want a parent to today. So he certainly was devastated and crushed. And my sense is that he and Martha both kind of saw it coming because she did have this fragility to her, and there was nothing she could do about childbirth. If she was going to have another child, it was going to happen at some point.
And death signified something else in this era from what it signifies today. It was closer to hand, and people had a more nuanced attitude towards it because you couldn't count on anybody surviving an ear infection or a throat infection or pneumonia and so on. I think if he had been Theodore Roosevelt, David, he and his daughter Martha might have said, she just didn't have enough life force. She just didn't have enough vitality. She didn't will to live enough. And I think he felt a little of that she was a giver up. But he was too exquisite in his manners to do that. So he had some special Madeira brought in for her that she was sipping. And it's almost like, Lindsay, a ritual out of a Jane Austen novel about the long death of a young woman in a bed at some rural place, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, when we think of, it's obviously it's a different country and it's fiction, but it's roughly the same era. It's not all that different. And so death and slow death and illness was a regular part of life.
So Jefferson is left with one daughter,
One daughter.
Martha. Their relationship was pretty intricate after that. There's two things on this list that I want you to comment about. One was the statement that Martha had said she wished Jefferson could get out from under slavery altogether, and the other is the James Callender story of Hemings and Jefferson and Martha being complicit in creating the cover story that the father of Sally Hemings' children was one of the Carr brothers.
She decided that slavery was a really bad idea and that she didn't want to go home to that world. She didn't want to go back into that morass. She knew what a horrible morass slavery was, and she probably knew more than we think she knew about all the dynamics of it. But she didn't want to go back to that world, and so she told her father. And of course, he agrees with her because Jefferson always agrees with people on this front, but can't do anything about it. And so, now he brings her back in. Of course, over time, she becomes more complacent with slavery, as they all do. But late in life, when it was James Callender had published his incendiary report on Jefferson, Dusky Sally, as he called her, in 1802, in September of 1802. So from 1802 until 1826, this story, rattled around the Jefferson world and was used by his enemies whenever they felt they had nothing else. And Martha must have known. Lindsay talked about the layout of Monticello. It would be very, very hard for Jefferson to have a 30-some-year sexual relationship with Sally Hemings and not this be known quite widely. But they never talked about it, so far as we know. That seems perfectly Jeffersonian. The story was that it wasn't Jefferson; it was Peter and Samuel Carr, the nephews. The nephews were these young Turks that were sleeping around on the plantation, and look what they've done. And isn't that amusing but awful at the same time? Was sort of the narrative. And Martha actually called in her children when she was dying, and made them get an account book, another one of the Jefferson diaries, and she showed them that it was impossible for Jefferson to have fathered the children of Sally Hemings. That she said, "This is proof. I want you always to realize he cannot have done this." She told them this. Well, now we know, thanks to the work of Dumas Malone, the great Jefferson biographer, that just the opposite is true, that Jefferson was in residence about 9 months before each of Sally Hemings' children was born. And so Martha was perpetuating the Peter and Samuel Carr fall guy myth, and it survived until 1990, and in some quarters it still exists today, Lindsay.
Yeah, so just a couple of things about those various approaches. So because she was such an essential part of Jefferson's life and estate, she understood both the human cruelties of slavery and the financial downfalls of the particular system. So she was very aware that they were in debt, and she wanted to get him away from it because I believe because, one, she knew about the Hemings relationship. Two, because she saw the cruelty firsthand and also saw France, so saw what a world was like where slavery was not present. But also, three, understood what was coming. I don't think she knew how bad the estate was in debt, but she certainly understood that there were going to be issues and slavery was going to be part of it, because unless you were a very careful plantation manager, which Jefferson was not, it often was not a economically beneficial system in places like Virginia. So for all of those reasons, she was opposed to the system, and I think continued to be opposed to the system and supported efforts to reduce his reliance and Monticello's reliance, but obviously none of those came to fruition. Just one other thought process in terms of the family lore piece. This was incredibly common. This was the usual way of Southern culture, that white women were complicit in shifting the narrative. And while I think we can condemn that, what we also have to remember is when we lose family members, we often sort of erase the sharp marks on the outside. Now, hopefully we don't obscure things this large, but I think that it's a very human thing to do, to try and remember people in the best positive light, even that if that means not always telling the truth. So I just wanted to sort of give that element to the story.
That's very generous of you.
It's true, too. We all have a narrative about everything, right?
Yeah.
We do.
So Jefferson dies in 1826. He's bankrupt. What happened to Martha after Jefferson's death?
Well, I'm with Lindsay. Martha had a sense of how bad things were, but she could not possibly have known that the whole house of cards was going to collapse almost instantaneously at the death of her father, that he was helplessly in debt, that they didn't have enough money to buy a pint of milk. They were doomed, and he had allowed this to happen. And it's not entirely his fault, but it's 98% his fault. And he just assumed that he could somehow pull it off. And yet, here's his beloved daughter, who is the great love of his life, I would say. And he leaves her in this incredibly vulnerable position because the whole thing collapses. And her son, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, has to supervise the selling of everything, the selling of the enslaved people, the selling of the livestock, the selling of outbuildings, they tried to sell Monticello. They sold what was left of his books. I mean, they auctioned everything, and it was only the tiniest little percentage of all of the debt that Jefferson still owed. So she's in deep trouble. She goes to Boston, to Massachusetts, partly to get away. She has relatives there. One of the daughters, Ellen, married a Boston man, Jefferson's favorite granddaughter, and she lives with them. And finally, the legislature of Virginia is just so embarrassed by this situation that they vote, I think, $10,000, or they vote a sum to her to try to extricate her from actual physical desperation in the last years of her life. So here's the daughter of America's Da Vinci, living thanks to public charity because her father, however magnificent he was in so many ways, lived without moral responsibility for what would follow his demise on July 4th, 1826. It's seldom talked about, David, but it's one of the most upsetting things for me about Thomas Jefferson, that he appears to have thought, well, something will happen.
I don't really have anything to add. I mean, it is a tragic moment for everyone involved. It's a tragic moment for his children. It's a tragic moment for all the enslaved people whose families were split and sold and divided, often never to be reunited. And it's devastating.
So, Lindsay, let me ask you a question. David, this is such a great story. I wish we could have the audience watch Lindsay react. When Martha gets married to Thomas Mann Randolph, her cousin, not her first cousin, but her cousin, Jefferson writes her this really extraordinary letter, and he says, all right, here's how marriage works. Never, ever, ever contradict your husband among other people. If he's full of it, if he says something crazy, if he does something awful, you must never confront him. That your duty is to be meek and if you have anything to say to him, say it in private, but never humiliate him among other people. To do so will poison the marriage, and you will never know happiness if you pursue that path.
Okay, so I actually think my response to this might surprise you. So I hate the word meek. It's terrible. And I think a good-natured ribbing now, again, is good for most men. But I also believe in not airing dirty...
And women, I would interject.
Well, that's true. But most husbands is what I mean. But I actually agree with the not airing of dirty laundry. I think fights and disagreements and battles and whatever have you should best be held privately, which maybe is a little bit old-fashioned, but I think is a good way to stay on the home team. You should be a team first and can figure out your differences in the locker room.
Well, you put the finest touch on that. You know, he says to her, your duty for the rest of your life is to please this man.
Yeah, I mean, that's garbage, obviously, so.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, David. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.